Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I was thrilled to receive this invitation to come here and speak to people in South Africa. And I'm even more honored to speak to people who really inspired me during my career and who are references for me. Adrienne, Michael, of course, Carlos, Mugendi, Professor Alpai, don't know where he is, but really inspirations to me and when I started studying and when I started working. So I'm really, really honored to be here. I hope I'll be able to show you some of my work, my recent work, since I moved back to Brazil. And I hope to be able to show you some of the research that I did in the UK and I applied through these years. And so I'm hoping to bring you something new during this speech. Let's go. Well, I'm coming from Brazil, and you know it's a country marked by contrasts. We have beautiful scenery, beautiful landscape, beautiful resources. We don't have much of a plan. I think make a plan is a great line for Brazil. That's what I'm going to show you. We have lots of colors. It's great, but really the plan is lacking over there. Well, recently we had the World Cup, and you had the World Cup here as well recently. So I think it may be quite fresh on your minds. You probably experienced the same as us, with lots of building works, building up to the big event. Lots of problems with the roads. So a big mess before the actual event. And then another mess during the event, but that's something that we don't talk about, because everything was very beautiful and people had fun, and we had the games, and the stadiums, thank to God, not to the plan. They were ready in time. And yeah, so now we have the big stadiums ready. And so during the event, we had a great party, until the party ended for us, and Angela actually had a great time in Brazil. And I don't know if everybody here is aware, but Brazil lost 7-1 to Germany. And yeah, it's painful. Still hurts deeply. But unforgettable, certainly. This was our logo for the World Cup. And this is how it turned. Yeah, graphic design played a lot here. Yeah, so our logo was really, really well designed, and it was really visionary. And it was a perfect turn. And yeah, but actually the World Cup gave us a huge, huge lesson. We are talking about the plan. And after we had that awful loss to Germany, 7-1, bad day for Brazilians. Of course, a lot of discussion, what happened. And something came up that we didn't lose in football. No, of course not. We lost for a plan. We lost for a very good strategy. Are there any Germans here? Great. You'll be able... Excuse me? Hello. Someone didn't like that I was going to talk about this. So, what happened and what was clear is that Brazil really didn't have a plan. Brazil was playing with just what they know what to do. Let's play football. But it's not only about football anymore. It's more professional. It's much better developed. And looking at what Germany did, it was really brilliant, as we would expect, but it was really a result of a plan. It was really a good lesson for all of us. And that started not recently, but that started actually about 10 years ago, since 2004, when Germany lost to Brazil in the World Cup, in the final, by the way, and when also did very badly in the Euro Cup. That was a bad performance. And because of the bad performance, it needed a plan to get better. And it was brilliantly done. It was a plan that involved working with the academia, working with the children and teenagers to find new talents, changing management, planning for a goal that was the World Cup again. It included going to Brazil to play the World Cup, included a long-term capability development that's about finding new talents, meticulous planning. Germany was the only country that actually built their headquarters in beautiful scenery in Brazil, but strategically placed in the middle, 4 hours from all the places where they had to play. So they had their own house there. They were very well equipped. They were very well installed. So they were able to prepare themselves to the matches, while the other teams were running across the country, changing from hotel to another hotel, and finding hard to adjust to the different weather. Collective over individual stars. So while Brazil had Neymar, half Neymar, because he was injured halfway through, so while we had Neymar and a few others, I can't remember their names even, they had a whole team who were playing together. Even the plan goes even to the strategy, for example, of teaching the children the same type of the same way of playing football. So when they get together, when they come from the little schools, when they meet together at the big German team, they all play the same way. That makes sense, doesn't? Like in Brazil, no. In Brazil, you have one team plays one way, the other team plays another way. And then when they meet together, they're not a team. They are actually competing with each other. Competitive intelligence. They had people informing. They had scientists and specialists, technicians, informing how to play. And local public campaign. They were really brilliant in getting Brazilians to actually support them. So it was not so hard to lose to Germany. Well, it was hard. Okay, it was hard. But it was not that hard. If we had to choose someone to lose to, that would be Germany, certainly. And so it was, they had a public campaign. Some of the players were actually speaking Portuguese. And that was very charming. They actually got the Brazilian supporters as well, what's important when you're playing in a World Cup. I'm telling you about sports and another story very similar we have from Great Britain. Great Britain did very badly in 1996 in Atlanta. They had actually only 1 gold medal. And they were going to host, they were already starting to think and starting to plan to host the Olympics in the UK. And how could they host the Olympics and had 1 gold medal in their country? That couldn't happen. So they started a plan to change the situation. And so we have 1996. Yesterday we had a challenge how to point out to both screens at the same time. And I have to say that's impossible. So on the bottom of the screen, 1996, in Atlanta, 1 gold medal, position 36. In 2008, you have in Beijing, it was already, they were already in position 4 with 29 gold medals. And in 2012, position 3 in London. So how does it happen? How can you change the situation of 1 gold medal to 29 gold medals? That doesn't happen by chance. That happens by plan. And I'm talking to you about sports. Here is the list of strategies they had in the UK to change the situation in sports. That was a program called World Class Performance Program. When they invested a lot of money to change the situation. And I'm talking to you about sports because it's easier to understand policy in this context. It's easier to understand what policy can do. Policy is something that the government put together to translate their political vision in actions to actually change the world. Desired changes in the real world. This is very important. Policy is about change. And you can only create a change, develop change, if you have a plan. what's design policy? Because design policy is a difficult thing to grasp. It's difficult to understand what it is. But it's about changing the situation or changing what you have, the scenery in design, in the design area. And it's about using design resources, using everything you have in the country to encourage the effective use of design in that country. Maybe you need to improve your design resources and to be able to have better results through design. But it's all about using design resources to change the situation in the country. Well, I have been working with design policies, design programs for the past 18 years. And during this time, I studied lots of different models, and I've worked with different models, design programs, and always trying to find similarities and differences between them. And there are lots of differences, lots of contrasts. Each country does in a different way, immensely depending on the resources, not only financial resources, but also people and materials and installations, depending on all these things. Design policies, we have here Finland, the 1951, the Great Exhibition. We have India, the brilliant Indian report. Better by Design in New Zealand, the report from Finland. South Korea, brilliant strategy, and UK. Just a few, just to cite a few. One of the things that strikes me about design policy and that influences the success of a design policy is actually the implementation. Is the capacity of making that policy or making that strategy a continuous plan. And I have here on this slide four countries, showing 4 countries. This slide is from my research, my doctorate research. I studied 4 countries, Brazil, India, Finland, and South Korea. And from these 4 countries, a big difference was the capacity of each country of actually implementing a policy, implementing a strategy, and actually carry on revising that policy and making it better after 5 years and after 10 years, actually improving the plan that you had before. If you see each bubble there is one stage. In Brazil, we are very good in having the first and the second stage, and that's it. India, at the time when at the time of this research, it's from 2009. The implementation wasn't in place yet. We will hear about India tomorrow, and maybe we will have a new perspective. In Finland, at this time as well, we actually had the complete implementation of the Design Policy 2005, Design 2005. But at that time, there wasn't yet a review of or an analysis of the impact, and I needed design policy in place to continue the impact. And in South Korea, I think what's brilliant in South Korea is the fact that they revise the policy or the plan. Sometimes talking about policy is a bit heavy, but they actually revise a plan every 5 years, every 5 years, and then it's actually continuing growing and continually improving the same plan that they had. And that's exactly what makes it better each time. If you start from scratch every time, it's very difficult to get it better. So if you actually improve over what you have, it's much more likely that you have better results. So implementation is really important in terms of guaranteeing the success of your policy. And there are two. Well, it's very easy to. It's not so immediate to divide in policy and programs, but we actually can consider that there are 2 types of implementation or 2 types of strategies. You can talk about policy, you can talk about programs. policies, as Michael was actually mentioning, sometimes it's difficult to think about policy because policy is actually something that the government has to lead. And you can't have a policy from the ground. You can't have a policy from citizens. You actually need the government to back it up. And policy is about strategy. It's about a long-term vision. It's about differentiation. Programs are a bit easier. You can actually implement. It doesn't need to, you don't depend on the government to start a program, and it's about implementing. A policy will need programs and will need actions to get it to actually work, to implement the policy or to implement the strategy. Programs can happen. They can be a set of programs without a policy, independent from the policy. And programs are about strengthening what you have. It can be anyone's initiative. And programs can be actually transferred. I've seen and I've worked in programs that we were actually transferring a practice from one country to another. And that's fine. That's fine. That works. You have to adapt to implement in your own country or in your own region. But you can actually transfer programs. You can transfer practices from one country to another. Strategies or policies, you cannot transfer. Policies and strategies, we are talking about something unique to the country. We are talking about something that has to identify your strengths or your weaknesses and work on those. You can't transfer a strategy from one country to another, even if it's a very similar country one to another. You can, of course, have inspiration, but you cannot transfer. And so in order to develop policy strategies, we really need to understand the context and determine what to change in that situation. This is very important, and this is everything about making a plan. That's what I want to stress in this presentation. We're talking a lot in the recent years working in my consultancy and working in Brazil. We're talking a lot about informed decision. Having information, having data to back up your ideas or your plan, to back up your plan, to base your strategy on. And we are developing this type of methodology or way to do it, where we think about where are you, in this case, where is the country, where do they want to go? What are the goals? What's the long-term vision? Where are others? Where are the other countries? What kind of good practice or what kind of examples we have from others? And then how do we get there? What's the plan? So I want to bring to you this case from Uruguay that's quite recent, and I can show you this step by step through this case. It's a study for the implementation of the national design policy there. Through this methodology, where are you, where do you want to go, and how to get there, we implemented some tools. We used various tools that combined gave us a good perspective or a good scenario about the situation in Uruguay and about how to plan for the change. So first we started, where are we? Setting the scene. So we had to learn, we had to go there, we had to learn what they're strong on, what type of resources they have, what they want for the future. Uruguay was very focused at that time on exports. They kind of had this idea about exporting design services and exporting design products. They thought one of the strengths of the country were the design makers, so which would be like small companies, startups, or designers who actually make their own products. And they thought that the important thing would be to export this type of service. So where do we want to go? What are their goals for the future? And where are the others? So we used benchmark, we used the scoreboard in some international reference to work with them. We had these diagnostics here on the bottom of the screen, on the right, your left, in this case. This is a type of diagnostics we did with the industry. We used a questionnaire and interviews with the industry as well. We did some visits to understand where they are in the use of design, use of resources, design resources, and also to evaluate the actual design resources, the actual design consultancies, to evaluate if they had good performance, not evaluating their portfolio, no, not that, but evaluating what type of techniques they use, how much business they are generating, what's the portfolio of clients, how they are connected with industry. That was our key point to understand, because we did this research with the two groups, with design consultancies and industry in a separate way. And then we had to cross-reference and try to understand if they were actually connected and if they were talking the same language and if they were actually being able to work together. So we used this reference, this type of research, to understand what we were talking about there and what the problems were. Another thing that was very important was to map the national design system. Why is this important? It's important because we're talking about policy. We're talking about organizations, people. We need to get into that. We need to map who is doing what, if everything is being covered, if we have enough resources, if there are any gaps on the system. When you map a national design system, we did the same in Brazil, you actually understand if the associations are more present, or if the associations are stronger, or if they have representation, if the industry have, for example, someone who is working on the connection of designers with industry, if there is a dialogue between designers and government. So actually you can see what's happening in that country. So mapping the national design system is very important. And if you have the opportunity to map the national design, the national innovation system, you can put together like a layer and see if there are connections or if they're completely separate. If you have different systems, different maps, for example, from industry, from the creative industries, you can see where the links are and if there are any missing links. So that's the importance of mapping these systems. For example, when we mapped this national design system, we found out that there were about 4 organizations that were actually doing very similar things and that were actually confusing designers. So designers prefer to stay away from the system or from the talks with government and with industry because they found it very confusing. So one of the things that we had to do was to differentiate each organization and say what each one was going to do. And that was very well received there. And how to get there. If there is something that an external consultant can't say is, look, this is the plan, now go and do it. You can't, being from another country, you can't just go in a country and say, that's the way how you do it. You can't do that. Because there is a culture there that has to be respected. There are ways to do things that you cannot ignore. And there is always a history of things that they have tried before. And as an external consultant, you can't learn everything that they've tried before. Only there is a local knowledge that you have to respect and you have to account for. So what we do is to bring them ideas about how to work on some strategy, and they tell you what's the best way to do it. And then we refine the plan. So we always have a kind of a workshop to understand their views about the plan that we are presenting. At this workshop, we present lots of different practices. And then we asked them to classify if that's actually relevant to them. No, we won't do this. This doesn't work for us. Maybe, that's the third column there. And something that they are already doing or that they've done before and they tried. So they classify the practices in different columns. And then we can understand what actually can happen to them, can actually work for them. And our plan will be much more assertive and much more adapted to the environment that we are working on. So in the end, we had a plan with various topics. That was the main thing about the plan was to work with communication and connection. In the beginning, they had this idea of exporting design services. But after all the study we did, all the research, we understood that actually they shouldn't try to export their design services because their design resources were actually very good. Their design consultancies are actually very good design consultancies. And they were trying to export as a government strategy. They thought that a good investment would be to incentivize or to help these companies, these design consultancies, to export their services. And then we came in and we asked, but what about your industry? Your industry is not using the design resources. So you're actually going to export a very important resource that you have in the country without keeping it here. Your own industry is not making use of this good resource. So one of our goals through this plan was to try to tell them how to connect industry with designers in the country and try to make that happen. So we devised a plan that had lots of steps from showing industry what type of application design could have, for example, in rural areas or with... Actually, because during the workshop they said, well, design is not very applicable here in the country because our type of industry wouldn't use design. And that's something that we heard from design consultancies and from the government. And that's very bad because they can't see how design can be applicable in their own country, in their own industry. So one of the work that we had there, one of the tasks we had was to show them how to apply design in their own industry, in their own agriculture and machinery industry that's not, for example, end user industry. It's not about designing only chairs or designing goods for the house. It's actually designing goods that will be used in other industries as well. So we had to work with them to change this idea and to help them to understand how to apply design in their own country, in their own industry. Another thing that was important was about creating a design organization that would connect industry and designers, and not necessarily a design organization that would work with designers only. No, but someone who would be next to the industry. Another thing that was that we actually had to work with them was to show how to apply design in the creative industries, because they were only understanding that design was part of the creative industries, but not that design could be a supplier to the creative industries. And that was an important work we had. Another thing was to show how design was applicable in government. There was something very strange that took me by surprise when we got there. That was about the fact that when you graduated in Uruguay until recently, you would receive a diploma, not a graduation degree. And with that, you couldn't apply for jobs that needed a graduation. What happened? The fact was that in the government, most of the jobs were for people who were graduated. With the fact that designers were not graduated, designers couldn't work in certain jobs in government. And we asked, don't you think that this is something that's prevailing designers from working together with government? And the answer was, no, but designers don't work in government positions. And I said, well, usually not, but that's the problem. If designers were working in government positions, we would probably have a more creative government. We would be able to develop better strategies or more creative solutions to the country. And then they said, oh, maybe not. So trying to work with them to change this type of preconceived ideas was a big job for this strategy. So we devised this plan that was all about changing this culture and bringing international reference and trying to change the situation there. It was really a plan to change the scenery and to change the position that they had about certain ideas in relation to how you apply design in government and in industry. So this was the plan there. Recently in Brazil, it was a similar situation when they asked us to develop a diagnostics for Brazil. Because in Brazil, they are about to develop a plan. But finally, they realized that before designing a plan, before developing a plan, you need to know what you're planning for. You need to know what type of resources you have. Because then we didn't know. For example, we didn't know how many design consultancies we have. And because it's such a big country, and we didn't have this number. Of course, it's not a precise number yet, but it's a start. So during these diagnostics, during this work, one of the things we did was to raise a campaign for design offices, for design consultancies to register, and to try to understand how many people we were talking about, how many people work in the design industry, what type of problems they have. And a number is just a number unless you cross-reference with something else. You can't say it's very, it doesn't mean much if you say Brazil has 683 design consultancies. But once you compare it with other numbers, with other countries, then you start having some sort of analysis or insights about what you can do with that number or what type of action you can take. So here, it will be difficult for you to read the whole table, and that's not the intention, but it's to show that we use the International Design Scoreboard, which is actually an old research. It's from 2009, from Cambridge, from Professor Mautrier. And well, in the lack of anything, in the absence of any other more recent research, we actually use this, and we use others that have been published more recently to try to make sense of our data. So here, we compare the number of design consultancies from Brazil with other countries. We have there the number from Norway. Norway has actually more design consultancies than Brazil. Then, of course, you can say, what does it mean? Why Norway has more design consultancies than Brazil, if you compare the population of both? But Brazil actually employs more people in the design industry than Norway. So from there, we understand that Brazil has larger design consultancies than Norway. If you go more in depth, you can compare with other resources. For example, the Global Competitiveness Report from OECD. And then you start understanding if, for example, opening design consultancies is a problem. Is it difficult for people to actually open a design consultancy? Is it what's preventing the design industry from growing? Then we see that Denmark has more design consultancies than people working in the design industry, if you compare the numbers from Denmark. And if you go into the history of design policies in Denmark, you see in the 90s there was a big campaign, a big strategy to incentivize people to open consultancies and to open startups. So it can be a result from that time when there was incentives for people to open their own design consultancies. And indeed, lots of these design consultancies are startups. They're very small. And then, is it good or is it bad for the design environment in a country to have more design consultancies, or is it better to have large design consultancies? So once you have this information, you start working to see what's the best solution for the country. Is it better to provide incentives for companies to grow, for design consultancies to grow, maybe with more expertise in one place, or is it better to have lots of different startups? Here is just, I'm not going into this graph, but just to show that we cross-reference as well with, for example, the Global Competitiveness Report. This is also part of the diagnostics in Brazil. We studied 9, I don't think they're all here, but we studied 9 different industries, types of industries, from footwear, ceramics, hygiene, production machinery, medical equipment, furniture, and fashion. There was also audiovisual. So we studied the different industries, the different sectors, to be able to provide information about each sector. And we found out some incredible data and some incredible insights about how each industry works. For example, we were very surprised about finding out that ceramic tiles is actually the most sophisticated industry in design management. Then imagine, of course, ceramic tiles, they all compete on the same square, literally. Yeah, they all have to design the same square. And so it's very hard to compete with ceramic tiles. So they really need design to compete in the market. And they use different resources. They have in-house design team. They also work with design consultants. They work with the freelancers, design management consultants, suppliers, and design schools. They work with the combination of all these different resources. And that's what makes them so sophisticated in design. It's actually the combination of various resources. So having a design team, an internal design team, is not the full solution. You actually have to combine different resources in a way to have fresh design in your company, in a way to have the best use of design, and also work with design schools. So now we are able to guide our clients, our company, the companies that are our clients, to actually have a variety of in their use of design, variety of actions to use design. And another thing that really surprised us was that big bubble, that big green bubble in the middle. It's the large use of freelancers in the hygiene and cosmetics industry. That's not good. From all the research we did, using freelancers in this type of industry shows that actually the freelancer is called that last minute when you really need a packaging or we really need a label, so let's call a freelancer. So that's not building any know-how in the industry. And there are industries where this is even worse, this situation is even worse. It's not here, one of the other sectors, but it's really a sector where you should be accumulating know-how internally, and so the use of freelancers is not a good solution in that sector. So this is the type of work that we are doing. We are trying to understand with accurate data what's actually going on in different sectors. As part of the diagnostics as well, and this diagnostics will be released in English very, very soon, now in December, I think, was about evaluating how design is used for exports in the country. And this information is also part of the report. If you have interest, you can access this report later. So what I'm talking about here is a three-tier approach. We use, actually from bottom up, we need data from bottom up. We need data from companies, from individual companies, to be able to inform the national design capability. If you don't have information from companies, from industry, you're not talking about accurate data. You're not talking about accurate information. You're not talking about informed decision. So we go into companies and we have a questionnaire. We have a way to collect data from them, and which is very hard. You probably, who works with research here, know how difficult it is to get information, to get data from companies. So what we do is to offer them an individual diagnostic. There on the bottom right for you, we give them an individual diagnostic that we, in exchange to the data. So they're more keen to provide us information and to provide data about their practices. On the second tier, we have industry. This type of research has been really useful for sector associations, for specific industry sectors, because they learn what's going on with their companies, how their own companies use design. Because the strategy for the ceramic sector will be completely different from the strategy to another sector, because they have different problems. And providing this type of data, they can go exactly into the problem, into where you're lacking information. And then we can inform countries or the national government. So the information data has to come from bottom up. And then, of course, the actions and programs will come from top down. So this is where, with DoCount, it's online based, we found that this would be very useful for collecting data. So companies can provide us their information, and we can give them back diagnostics. And it makes much easier to collect data and to work with associations. So just to close to go back to sports and make this link, if a sport is managing to make changes, so what can we learn from their practice? The first thing I want to show you was about their meticulous planning, to highlight, to conclude here, was their meticulous planning for long-term results. So, for example, Germany was able to build their own headquarters, was able to make a plan, a 10-year plan, and actually get to their objective. That was, in this case, was the World Cup. So this kind of meticulous planning is very important. I talked here about South Korea, that had the plan that's revised, often revised. And this is the type of information that I'm talking about. This type of the type of practice I'm talking about, and the plan that we had for Uruguay, that's we had priorities. So in 1 year, what are the goals for 1 year, for 3 years, for 5 years, and then for 10 years. Typically, it takes about 8 years to form an athlete. So that's important. That's why it's important to start early. You actually have to form people in order to get a result in the end. Multi-fast approach is the fact of having information from different areas. If we only work in the design bubble, we don't get very far. In the case of sports, for example, they really need to work with sports psychologists, for example. The German team had, Brazilian team didn't. After the first goal, they were, oh, where do we go now? The second goal, my God. The third goal, chaos. And then they got to the 7th goal, and then forget it. But so that's why it's important to work with other areas. You have to be modest. You have to be to have the simplicity, or you have to be open for other expertise to come and work with you. Statistics, for example. Work with the whole team. The importance of mapping the whole design system and to match the design system with other systems, with innovation system, with industry network. And to finish here, the story of the competitive intelligence. So what I want to highlight through this presentation was the importance of data, the importance of having informed decision. you need to have data and you need to have arguments. You need to know what you're doing in order to make your plan more assertive. It's a big investment to make a design program. It's a big investment for a government to design a policy and to commit to such investment. So it's important to make the government very, very confident about that investment. It's important to be able to measure your impact. So we are using that type of diagnostic to measure how the company is when it enters the program and how the company is when it leaves the program. And then with this gap, measuring the difference between the entrance and the way how the company leaves the program, we can talk about the impact. And this has made a lot of difference when we speak to governments. Okay, so this is what I want to bring for you. I hope to be able to give you some insights through this presentation. And I'll be here through the next 2 days in case you have any questions, because now we have the next presentation, don't we? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I must thank you for the opportunity to be here and to speak about something that's very dear to my heart, which is the development of a design policy for South Africa. I do realize we still have a long way to go in that direction, but I do also believe that if we don't start the process, it will never happen. And a lot has been done in the past, basing what we do now on something that's not in a vacuum. It's been there before. So I'm going to speak in a much more academic sense. I'm not going to have color pictures up on the wall. It will be much more sort of text. We'll talk about where we are at the moment in South Africa. I want to briefly discuss some of the pitfalls on our way to developing the design policy, but also to talk about what is there and what is already in place for that purpose. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to stand and read my text, most of it. So you are welcome to close your eyes and just listen to my voice. There's no going only up at the end. There will be some slides up to illustrate what I'm saying. So let us talk about design now, but let's talk about design in South Africa. And let's talk about what and where we are going and what kind of plan is in the making here. We live in a rapidly changing world. And if we look back at over the past 20 years, the more significant changes came by the way of the rise of China as an economic powerhouse, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, that is the destabilizing world peace, a rise in social unrest that accompanies the European economic meltdown, and uncontested scientific evidence of a climate that is detrimentally changing the planet and our environment. And these issues that I've just mentioned can be classified as the meta-narratives that are currently developing that is probably unique in world history. These are meta-narratives that's not been in place 10 years ago. We also now have new political alliances between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or commonly known as BRICS, that poses challenges for a South Africa that is not yet comfortable with its own internal transformation from an apartheid state to a full democracy. Characterized by a history of inequality, South Africa still faces the problem of implementing policies that do not favor the kind of socio-political changes that could introduce a working social, democratic, and economic redistributive approach. On top of growing poverty, we face, according to one of our main philosophers, Saint-Peter Blanche, the harsh reality in present-day South Africa that income is being wrongly and unlawfully redistributed by means of crime, violence, and corruption. Now, finding a comfortable socio-political space in this rapidly changing world is a challenge to the design disciplines. In 1983, we had Marshall Berman made the observation that design is not a value-free enterprise in its relation with modernism and the embracement of capitalism. However, design is one of the disciplines that uncritically absorb the futurist ideology of capitalism, including its ideal of displacing man with machine. These comments followed in the wake of the systems thinker Fritz Schumacher's inspirational book, Small is Beautiful, that I think still serve today as inspiration to our young designers, that saw modernism as a problematique that requires social attention. For Schumacher, society is able to function in patterns and intermingled relationships in opposition to the growing Western capitalist model. He promoted the creation of self-reliant economies by means of appropriate technologies. Many designers of that time and beyond were inspired by his vision of a clear, clean, self-reliant world, adopting technologies fit for purpose rather than for destruction in service of their ideological intolerance. And Japan, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and many other nations can attest to this. We are now aware of the destructiveness of the Western modernist model of man over nature, and the way in which we are trying to placate society with material goods, or we can call it greed, to satisfy non-material needs. Even Marx commented on this issue by blaming the bourgeoisie for the transformation of the world by putting to an end all previous relations between man and nature in support of naked greed and its one single intent, profit. Today, the very act of making money reduces the world back into a fairly primitive state of existence, with personal wealth serving as indicator of the development of a civilization. In the late 1980s, John Thakkara stated in his Design After Modernism that design is not a neutral tool. It is a planning activity whose aims and procedures are dictated by commercial and political interests. Jean Baudelaire proposed later on that the ecstasy of communication in the information age destroyed the possibility of art and design to play a socially progressive or even meaningful role. Rooted in these perceptions, we find debates that the separation between culture and the social is becoming the contested middle ground, with, on the one hand, cultural traditionalists seeking the restitution of cultural products and blaming modernism for social ills promoted by capitalism. On the other hand, we find growing concern for the dominance of autonomous and different, or we can say differentiated fields of experts, and a plea for a transdisciplinary practice in art and design that is rooted in a vernacular but does not allow art and design to function in a privileged and exclusive space. Modernism in this way became fatally compromised by the realization that progress is not synonymous with an increase in the quantity of manufactured goods, and that design aesthetics embedded in crafts still serve a purpose. Art and design in the end is not an idyllic field of knowledge, but an empirical system that functions within an economic and socio-political environment. The new awareness that we need to support renewable ecosystems and ensure sustainable development was fast-tracked by the realities of social changes we face due to a change in climate. With all of humanity under threat of an invisible and mostly unpredictable danger, driven by notions of bad weather, we all know those conversations, the right to humanize work as a dignified and meaningful activity might just become important again. High on today's agenda are issues such as environmental justice, animal rights, ecological literacy, public policy, nature conservation, women's rights, population control, renewable energy, labor rights, fair trade agreements, and many others, actually too long to list. We are all participating in general in these debates. It might, however, be too late to change the way in which we run our economies and social systems. The multinational corporations are ruling supreme in their destruction of resources other than the minerals they seek. For societies, changes in the climate are wreaking havoc with perceptions of what we always see as a stable world. No wonder that the seemingly unstoppable socio-economic inequalities are giving birth to so many social movements working in the environment, society, and in politics. It is also not surprising that the same social movements are now leading the, and I can say violent mostly, protests in their demands for democracy and social justice. So the 60s and the 70s utopian dreams of a technologically advanced world have changed dramatically over this past 20 years. The technological future is not the one that was predicted. Instead, philosophers like Slavoj Zizek poses that versions of a pending apocalypse by religious fundamentalism, New Age promoters, and the techno-digital post-human, where digital machinery is mediating social relations, provides us with damning predictions regarding the future world we face. With our collective reason serving as a model and mode to survive, human dominance over nature has led to humans being considered as a geological force, or what they call now lately the so-called Anthropocene, which in reality just means that we are now beginning to look at the human beings not as something separate from nature, but we are now being looked at as a species together with the other species on Earth. And that already is a very interesting debate that is developing. We face the reality that the global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptical 0 point. Its Zizekian riders of the apocalypse are compromised by the ecological crisis, the consequences of the biogenetic revolution, imbalances within the system itself. These are problems typified by problems with intellectual property and forthcoming struggles over raw materials, food and water, and the explosive growth of social divisions and exclusives. So, what I'm arguing for is that this threat to our survival on this planet is real. And the question can be asked, will design ensure a better life for all? How can this persistence as one of the indicators of an economy based on new liberal principles be transformed into something more humane? How will design sustain its fatal status of valuing progress with the increase in the quantity of manufactured goods instead of valuing and contributing to ecological sustainability? And I also want to say that don't try and counter this statement by proposing that recycling is a solution to the overproduction of goods, since it's only treating symptoms originating from within a much more destructive origin. And lastly, how will we manage a functional modernist aesthetic against a turn towards the local, the indigenous, and the cultural? Design has always consisted of extremely functional disciplines, such as industrial design, fashion design, all the design disciplines we know. However, in a Bourdieuian sense, design is also an indicator of social values within a framework of what is referred to as habitus. As argued by Pierre de Bow, habitus is the way society becomes deposited in person in the form of lasting dispositions or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinate ways which will guide them. Habitus is created through a social rather than individual process that leads to patterns that are enduring and transferable from one context to another, but that also shift in relation to specific contexts and over time. Habitus is not fixed or permanent and can be changed under unexpected situations or over a long historical period. Habitus is neither a result of free will nor determined by structures, but created by a kind of interplay between the two over time. Dispositions are both shaped by past events and structures that shape current practices and structures, but also, importantly, that condition our very perceptions of these. Aesthetic sense, design stability, and social fashions are all symptoms and results of the outcome and implementation of habitus. So, to ask the question then, what is the role that we can talk about in design. And to put this whole issue of design in context, I've listed a few of these characteristics, you can say, about design. Design has the ability to create an adaptable and sustained social system, and that is habitus, and as habitus, and it is beyond the economic boundaries, where we tend to think more economics and politics, but it is also something different, while also being compliant with destructive economic models. Design is not a neutral tool, but embraces commercial, political, and social interest in its function as propagator of modernism. Design fuels new technologies and is an intimate partner of science research. Design assists in the creation of products that meet social needs, or can we ask greed, and promote cultural identities. Design as habitus is implied to decorate ourselves, to drive modern technologies, to provide status and identity, and to assist in the destruction of other cultures of opposing and or different ideologies. The list is extensive, but the message is simple. Design drives the world. Neglecting to include design into our policy system is therefore inexcusable. So, the question now arises, what is the current status of design in South Africa? And to answer this, we should turn attention to localized issues. And now I'm really trying to embed what I'm speaking about into the situation here in South Africa. It's not applicable, and I already excuse myself here, it's not applicable to other countries. This is our identity. In the first place, we have a dual system for recognizing design. On the one hand, we find indigenous design functioning as marker of cultural identity and social support. In 1948, the Afrikaner nationalism in this country gave rise to a visual language that primarily identified with European modernism, and depictions by artists of the so-called promised land in identification with the so-called conquered landscape. The conquered land's inhabitants, including the crafters and the artists, were stripped of scientific and or technological expertise, and the indigenous designs regressed into tourist curiosities. And I very often think that it is still applicable today. In the second place, we find design in the formal education system deeply embedded within the European context of modernity. Our design education is a reflection of this through its Bauhaus-embedded education system. This duality is still evident today and introduces us to a complex and somewhat frozen in time challenge. How do we deal with this duality when drafting a fair and representative national design policy? That is going to be the big question. So there have been steps made towards getting to this point of now talking with a bit more confidence about the possibility of having a design policy, and also the possibility of implementing and designing a design strategy for South Africa. Now, fairly recently, it was in March, we had a workshop where, no, I'm now jumping the gun here. I want to first talk about our National Development Plan before we go to our workshop. And I think for the international guests here, you often hear our referencing towards the fact that we now have in place a National Development Plan. That was a very deliberate action. It's a very important document. It's highly contested from some regions, and others are very much in favor. But it is a kind of vision that has been adopted by government, and everybody else is looking at this with quite eager eyes. Now, this is in lee with a lot of other strategies that's been put in place. We have the Department of Trade and Industry, a National Industrial Policy Framework. We have an Industrial Policy Action Plan to support design-based activities. The Department of Science and Technology compiled a 10-year innovation plan and a National Research and Development Plan that supports design and innovation interface activities. The Department of Arts and Culture is currently moving towards a selective support in this endeavour. The driver for further development up to 2030 is the National Development Plan, drafted by the National Planning Commission situated within the Presidency. This report is the result of the Commission's diagnostic report in 2011 that reported on the failure of the country to implement policies and identified an absence of broad partnerships. 9 primary challenges were identified in this first document, the Commission's diagnostic report. And I think they are very generalized, but if you look at the 9 factors, you realize very quickly that in all of them there is some kind of role that design is going to play, either in the planning and the restructuring, or then in actual making it easier to happen and to take place. Very broadly and very fast, too few people work in this country. The quality of school education for black people is poor. Infrastructure is poorly located, inadequate, and under-maintained. Spatial divides hobble inclusive development. The economy is unsustainably resource intensive. The public health system cannot meet demand or sustain quality, and public services are uneven and often of poor quality. This is really like telling you what is in that closet. And the report is very clear about what is in the closet. These are the issues that we are facing, and we have to be honest about them. And we have to be fairly blunt about what we do. And then lastly, I think the 2 last points are actually the ones that are really putting a lot of hindrance in our way to develop. The one is the corruption levels that are too high. And the last one, South Africa remains a divided society. In connection with the last point, I just want to mention that we often now hear from our politicians from all over when we listen to their presentations that they speak about this divided society, and they speak mostly about the lack of trust between the races in this country, between the industries in this country, between the government departments, between the people in the townships, etc., etc. It goes down to really rock bottom. Basically, it says we don't trust each other anymore. And something has happened in South Africa that is now breaking this trust, and it is a really serious matter to address. So government is now really looking again at, for instance, in my institution has been part of the exercise now to look at what pillars are required, for instance, to get to a new social compact in this country. How do we forge links again between industry, the people, and the government? What kind of measurements do we need to put in place for people to start to trust each other? It's a very big project. It's a very big challenge to actually identify those specific areas and how do we build trust. So the National Development Plan declares that arts and culture opens powerful spaces for debate about where a society finds itself and where it is going. Promoted effectively, the creative and cultural industries can contribute substantially to small business development, job creation, and urban development and renewal. For instance, South Africa's music industry is worth 2.2 billion in sales. The crafts sector contributed 3.3 billion to the GDP in 2010 and employs more than 273,000 people. And the visual arts sector has a turnover of nearly 2 billion. So these are really big statistics, and these are really positive kind of acts to take. Now, inside the National Development Plan, the arts is mentioned, and I nearly feel like Michael has asked us to stand up and point north, but we still don't know where north is. I think this is pretty much an exercise of asking, and we do it very regularly with the interactions with government and other groups in South Africa. Have you read the National Development Plan? And we do acknowledge that it's a very thick document. We do acknowledge that it is quite extensive, but it's written very clearly. It's divided into action points that is really clearly able to identify. So we are international here, I'm not going to say, put up your hands, who's read the National Development Plan? But it is very ironically, most of the time, to see people has not read this. They speak the speak, but they're not walking the walk about this. So I just pulled out some of the issues that is inside our National Development Plan that gives direction already on what they promise South Africans they will provide, and that is what they envision. And lacking that insight in what the document is required from us is actually the fact that we need to read it and then start to insist or make a plan to make these things happen. They promise providing financial and ICT support to artists to enable the creation of works expressing national creativity while opening space for vibrant debate. They promise the strengthening of Independent Communications Authority of South Africa's mandate for nation building and value inculcation. They're incentivizing commercial distribution networks to distribute and or host art. Developing and implementing plans for a more effective arts and culture curriculum in schools with appropriate educator support. Supporting income smoothing for artists in a special unemployment insurance scheme and evaluating funding models for such incentives and initiatives. Developing sectorial determination legislation frameworks to protect the arts sector employees. Now, I read this arts sector as the arts and design because we cannot separate those two industries. If you do read it in that way and say the arts and design is one area, it's one space, it's the creative industries that they share, how are we going to now move towards getting to this promise? And what are we going to put in place to make sure that government provides these initial steps that they have identified? So we do have a basis and we do have pointers, but the challenge will be for us in South Africa now to pick up on these and to extend on that, because it is also widely accepted that the National Development Plan is a guide. It tries to give direction, but it is not the ultimate document. It is what the population and what the professionals are now going to do with what is being put in place that will make it work or not. So, if you look at mapping design in South Africa, and here I really want to mention the work that the South African Bureau of Standards Design Institute has done in the past. It's many years of hard work mapping the terrain, how many of the industries are there, and I'm sure it can be shared with everybody, the kind of map that is in existence. It's not updated, it needs a bit of updating. That gives you a kind of scope of how big this industry is in South Africa and how comprehensive the actions are that is captured in this. We have no lack of design activities in this country. If we start to talk about the private sector that is led by the Design Indaba, Decorex, Dulex, Fashion Weeks, the Lurie Awards, the Penduring Awards, the PG Bison Student Awards, the Rooms on Views events, the Social Innovation Network, the Design Innovation Summit, the Western Cape Furniture Initiative, and the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability, the Innovation Community Network, etc., etc. We have high-quality, off-the-shelf interior design lifestyle magazines. I'm sure the visitors to South Africa are able and are curious to look at our internally designed and published magazines like the South African Elle Decoration, the House and Leisure, and Visi, that promotes local design and local designers. It's also supplemented by trade magazines like the Design Indaba and Wallpaper, and the public is easily informed about design matters, and the public is quite knowledgeable about what function design has in the country. Those scarce actually very scarce. Local academic journals like Image and Text provide opportunity for designers to academically report on research in a peer-reviewed kind of journal mechanism. The few professional organizations, example the Engineering Council of South Africa and the Design Education Forum, indicate the ability to structure and organize activities within specialized areas. The private design education institutions, some 20 in number, provide ample choice and opportunity for design education and are supplemented and complemented by specialist courses at 10 universities. Funding for design-based research and design-based product development is widely available. For example, the National Research Foundation and the TIA, which is an Idea Development Fund. There is no doubt that the design industry in South Africa is large, but it is widely dispersed. However, the one aspect that could provide guidance and support from government is lacking. And that is, like we all now know, South Africa does not have a design policy. And I firmly believe getting that policy in place will actually help us to bring together this very diverse but very exciting and in existence groups of people to get a direction and to start to provide input into the way that we run this country. So to start the process of the strategic planning and drafting of a design policy, we had a design policy workshop in March 2014 in partnership with the Department of Arts and Culture, the South African Bureau of Standards Design Institute, and the Human Sciences Research Council. And this workshop witnessed the first concerted effort to discuss the challenge of South African design communities and what they face in marshalling the power of design to contribute meaningfully to the national challenges of high unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And then very short, to summarize those challenges, the first is the more effective translation of research, development, and invention into sustainable economic opportunities and market successes. And secondly, to be more responsive to the needs identified by the national economic and industrial growth policies. So the focus of the discussion was very broadly under three specific topics. We had discussions on the policy development process to ensure buy-in from all, and that will mean that it will also have the attention of the relevant minister. And it addressed the following pointers: the advancement of new strategies through possible multiple viewpoints to ensure a rich diversity of ideas, the development of methods for problem naming and framing in the structuring of the policy, discussion on critical inquiry of tools that could foster the examination of research depositories and data sets, some of which may be conflict or incomplete, to facilitate strategies for grappling with divergent values, worldviews, and ideologies, and it's a very important point, and then capturing agreements to ratify and prepare for implementation. We also discussed, and the idea is to further discuss.
I have a question. Perhaps you can help me understand.
Okay. Sorry, I thought it was something. I'll answer it just now. Okay. I thought something is burning behind me. It happened a while ago when a plug started burning when I was speaking, and I thought, oh no, not again. I'm not plugged in. Sorry for that. Okay, we were talking about the economic interventions, and those were identified as subsidizing, where we need financial compensation for design services by government to businesses and organizations to stimulate growth, investing in established design associations and networks that promote and assist other organizations in utilizing design as a strategic tool, and then to start to create an opportunity and a possibility for better networks. And then lastly, we talked about the infrastructure development, and that is also now in the cards for further discussions. This was just the start of the long conversation, where we need to look at accreditation, awards or certifications, acting as a benchmark in good design practice, promotion and public awareness, where we have guides, pamphlets, exhibitions, etc., etc. I don't think we lack that, but what we do lack is a concerted national effort to bring that to attention to everybody in the country. And then curriculum skills, the education, design, talent development, reflecting the ambition and competitiveness of this nation's design sector. As a speaker at the workshop, Stephen Narsu, for instance, commented on the value of design thinking combined with entrepreneurial support, which could provide South Africa with a competitive edge. It is generally accepted that there is no lack of opportunity and or choices for implementation. In that regard, he subtracted from the National Development Plan 109 actions and 71 of the objectives, where design can easily find the possibility for participation. The NDP strategically provides space for application until 2013 through the promotion of small business development, innovative export orientation, employment growth, the promotion of competitiveness, the growth of research and development and commercialization, and support for economic growth and entrepreneurship. The Industrial Development Policy Action Plan, short-term plan, for instance, has 350 milestones, 79 action plans and 21 strategic clusters, again with ample opportunity for design, research and implementation. It became clear from the workshop discussions that a design policy should be sensitive to main economic and socio-political streams, and two factors became quite prominent. The one was design policy in support of the economic value of South Africa, and secondly, design policy in support of social transformation, or the new buzzword we use now is social innovation in South Africa. So if you look at the objectives of this workshop, it's also good to look at what's happening outside of this area in other countries. And I really appreciate the first presentation where we could have an opportunity to look at that broad spectrum. I did not include lots of those factors, but I think the one that is really serving as a good complementary for what we need to do is the one that comes from the United Kingdom Design Council, where they recommend 4 basic mainstream issues. They use the public sector design ladder as a tool and roadmap for progression. They build design thinking into government and public policy practice, very important. They build a strong design sector that can offer strategic and service design to the public sector, and they build evidence-based and impact measurements for design innovation in the public sector. So, to conclude, South Africa is not lacking in its design efforts. There's more than enough to build on. What we now need to do is to start to come together and get to some point where we have an agreement on a kind of policy that will serve the identity, the specific socio-economic issues that we face. We also know, and Mugendi has clearly illustrated, how much design and designers has moved into Africa. And there's a number of projects that's been done in the past. The one that comes to mind is the Global Africa Project in 2008 at the New York Museum of Art and Design, where they traveled across Africa and collecting evidence of design, not just indigenous designs, but also design sort of transgressions and design complementaries, where you have a beautiful Japanese kimono design, but the cloth is African design, those kind of mutations. What one can gather from that is that design is capable of transgression and transformation, and it is an opportunistic area that allows for individual expression, global consumerism, and political manipulations. It is also a driver for the economy. Our local film industry adds 3.5 billion to the South African GDP. And once a year, events like the Design Indaba, for instance, generates in excess of 201.9 million in business orders and contributes 385.2 million to the South African GDP. In this presentation, I argued for a national design policy that will take into account the complexity of this discipline in its need to function in a changing world. To do so in a transdisciplinary manner will require skill and political acumen. So just to conclude, as a kind of indication of where we want to move forward in this, how we want to develop this further, my own institution, the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, most people refer to it as MISTRA, has now launched a project, Arts and Development, the Evolving South African Challenge, where we want to look at specific areas in this to feed maybe what Giselle was very nicely, or Gisela, I don't know which is the correct pronunciation, to indicate that sort of division, because she was talking about this issue that you have your policy, which is very much embedded in the government, and government is actually constructing policies, but they are also responsible for the implementation of those policies. And then you have programs, and I think what we do is we now fall under the division of a program, which is an action that is transferable, that is creative, and that will feed into this understanding of where we are, and to fit the South African society in its role in national development and the vision of 2030. We're looking at a few key areas. We're looking at the and I've just got my last slide there. We're looking at developing an understanding and a vision for the arts, where we ask the question, which arts and for whom? And it will open up a process of thinking covering identity, inclusion, and exclusion in the arts. We're exploring the officialdom and the arts, which will focus on the approaches the government and the private sector has taken and are currently taking in respect to arts, culture, and heritage, and the alignment of those approaches with the project's emerging vision. We will look at education and the arts so that we can have an understanding of the dynamic arts education in school curricula and the use of arts and culture as an educational facilitator. We will look at and critique the presentation of the arts in the National Development Plan and the Vision 2030, and we would like to then develop pointers to say where there are the gaps, and that is by invitation by government to say that this document is not cast in stone, we need to work further on it. And then lastly, the area of global dynamics and the impact on the arts, where we will look at the impact of grand scale economic investment in Africa on the cultural landscape. So what I finally want to do is extend an invitation to anybody who would like to also participate in this fairly ambitious, quite big project, to see what we can find out about the arts that can then feed into the development of a design policy. So we do it from the side. I just want to complete my presentation by saying that one of the issues that I think is also important to work is to work for the arts and designers to work outside of their disciplinary domains, to move a bit outside of their comfort zones, and to start to interact much more with government, difficult as it is, but also to interact much more and speak more to industry, and speak more to just the public or the publics like we like to refer to, and hear what are the needs and share ideas and have this kind of open-ended dialogue that will actually inform our understanding of our own design responsibilities. I thank you.
I really enjoyed Giselle's presentation. And the one thing that I picked up from that is gone are the days of the Godzina. The Godzina complex is going to dust because we need to think of design as a participative and co-design kind of process. So that's one thing I picked up. And I also liked what the Premier said earlier on about design being about solving problems with ingenuity and with vision. And I'd like to add also with courage. So there are many people here. I can't say hello to everyone. I see Ezio, I see Pradyumna, Carlos, who was the president of ICSID at the time, that they had a very special focus on Africa. So I'm sure this is a very special moment for him as well. Adrienne, my mentor, Richard, director of the World Design Capital. I'll just stop there because otherwise I won't get to my presentation. But I'm very grateful to be in this audience. Africa is a big place. I mean, everyone who lives on the continent knows that. You know how long it takes to get from one corner of the planet to the other. And what I've done is I've picked on the Adinkra symbols from Western Africa, which are very popular, particularly in Ghana. And there's quite a number of Ghanaians. There's Ralitza, there's Eric, there's Prosper, and a number of others that are in the audience that are very familiar and have grown up with this very rich system of symbols. But what's good about the Adinkra symbols is actually wisdom condensed and encapsulated in a very interesting visual mode. And I find them very, very economical tools just to express very big ideas, but in a very succinct and very elegant way. So for example, that's the symbol for interdependence, sorry. I'm not going to give you the Ghanaian word for it, but what that represents is that teeth, the set of teeth that you see interlocked have to share the mouth with the tongue. Okay, so the idea that the teeth must do their job and the tongue must also coexist, very much like what I'm doing now, without occasionally having to bite the tongue. We need to be interdependent. And if we look at this infographic, which was around 2009, you can see what would happen if the world were 100 people. You can see quite an interesting bit. I know you know about the gender bit. But at that time, 15 people out of the 100 would have been Africans. That was about 2009. You can look at literacy. You see 82% of people with literacy, about 18% not literate. And also the selection of infographics here is that more people relate, obviously, to the visual symbol and pictures than they would to text, for that matter, and so on. But then we run along a little bit to a more recent infographic, and you will notice that the Africans now are at 15, right at the top where you see continent. Again, like Giselle over there, somewhere there. And okay, I'll stop trying from this side. So Africa took one person from Asia and another person from Europe to get to that number. So that gives you a sense of how quickly Africa is actually changing, and you can see the other demographic details that are indicated there. And again, if you look at the age, because I think this is what's interesting, there's a global phenomenon of aging right across the world, even in Africa. In countries like China and Japan and France, it's very dramatic. In Africa, which is the youngest continent on the planet, one may not be as conscious of this trend, which is just as important. In fact, if you look at Africa, out of our just around over 1 billion people, 300 million are between the ages of 15 and 24, which is what the UN classifies as the youth. So it's quite an interesting thing to see that. And you'll notice as part of my presentation, I'll be trying to emphasize the need to engage with policy and strategy that actually taps into the aspirations of the youth, not just because they represent a very energetic resource, but also because they're the future. And if we are not careful, we will not be investing in a bright future if we ignore our youth and their aspirations. And then if you look at the infographic on the right-hand side, you'll notice some very interesting trends. Around 1950, there was not a single African country that was among the top 10 most populated nations in the world. You'll see that China was the biggest country in population, followed by India, and the US was number 3. If you look at the 2013, which is just last year, demographics, you realize that that did not change much, but suddenly we had Nigeria which is locked in there at almost number 6 out of the top 10. Nigeria, actually, in our context, is the largest country in population. It's just slightly larger than the size of Texas, with almost 700,000 square kilometers. And yet it has 174 million or so people. It's now the largest economy on the continent, according to the latest revised economic data. But what's interesting is if 1 in 6 Africans is a Nigerian, because that's what it means, and I'll be happy to be the symbolic Nigerian on my particular row, since we're about 6 of us, it means there's a lot of energy that is going on there that needs to be engaged with. If you look at what happens around 2050 based on the forecasts, Nigeria will have about 276 million people. On some projections even push it to 440, which is the doomsday scenario, which would be very scary. But that would push it to number 3, where India takes over from China, and China becomes second in terms of population. Now, that's very interesting, because in the same year, 2050, Africa's present population of about 1 billion is expected to be about 1.9 billion. So it's almost double the population it is. And some projections suggest that by the year 2100, Africa's population could be 4.1 billion, which is really scary. Now, remember, in 2050, the world is expected to be about 9 billion people. So when you see that size of Africa's population at almost 2 billion, that gives you an indication of just how large that particular continent is going to be. And then Africa is a place, in fact, with many challenges. It's got opportunities, but it also has challenges. There's many ironies of Africa, where 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world are from Africa, including Ethiopia, which until very recently was renowned for the malnourishment and famine. Now, ironically and poetically so, Ethiopia's population growth, it puts it as the second largest country in Africa at present, okay? But what's interesting is its growth in terms of economy is actually driven by agriculture, of all the kind of economies you'd expect. That's just one thing. But if you look at Africa's population, because again, Africans are, among other things, are known for their high fertility rates. They say that about each woman in Africa has about 6 children. We hope that that goes down. We still love large families. I'm the first of a family of 12, just to give you a bit of context. But I've learned my lessons. I have only 2 children. So just to look at all these statistics in context, looking at what the internet is going to do in terms of unlocking the continent. All those bright areas, if you see the white areas, that's where there's really high internet penetration. And then where there's red, there's few people, but still with very good internet access. And the blue area, which unfortunately, except for Southern Africa and a bit of Nigeria and a bit of Northern Africa around Algeria, Morocco, and so on, is actually quite blue, and many other parts are completely dark. So we need to start to envisage, despite the fact that Africa has the fastest growing mobile telephony industry in the world, we still need to see that there's a lot that needs to be unlocked. Then in terms of access to energy, last year there was a very interesting project that was launched. In fact, this year again it was mobilized again when President Obama of the US led what is known as the Power Africa Initiative. So hopefully this will start to redress issues. But at the same time, we don't want to also just go into the old inefficient grid systems. We need to start to think of how Africa can look at distributed energy, renewable energy, which is abundant on this continent. In fact, just for a fact, the Congo River has enough water in terms of its volume to electrify the whole of Africa, just from the water it has alone. But the place is quite impenetrable, so the challenge is how to access those areas. So if you look at the populations that don't have energy, for example, the dark colors in those bands, you can see where Africa sits. You can see Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, and North Africa right at the bottom. So those give you a sense in which we need to see design policy and design strategies unlocking areas way beyond just the traditional disciplines of design, which is about making and creating objects and systems and services. I think something has frozen. Okay. So the symbol for leadership or charisma means that we need to look at Africa in its true form. This is actually how Africa looks with its 54 countries and some 62 territories, including those that are within the greater geographic region. We have South Sudan, which unfortunately is going through some challenge, but is the newest country in the world, having come into being in July 2011. And if you look at the Mercator projection, which is what we usually see, you can see Africa doesn't usually get the kind of the benefit of the scale. It's very efficient in terms of cartographic representation, but I just want to remind us that sometimes in the process of trying to simplify and economize on ideas, we may lose the sense of scale. So the true size of Africa is something much more daunting, and I'm hoping you can start to see how Africa actually subsumes so many of these other large countries that we're accustomed to. For example, the whole of the US fits nicely into West Africa. China goes into most of Central and Southern Africa. India, East Africa, and in fact, India has a long tradition of relationships with Eastern Africa already. So, and Pradyumna, I know, has already spoken a bit of Gujarati in Nairobi, and Shwini will be doing some Hindi as well soon. So we have a huge continent that has a lot of influence from other parts of the world. For example, just to give you a sense, Swahili, which is the language spoken in Eastern and Central Africa, is spoken by about 250 million people. And it's got about 70% of Swahili is based on the local Bantu languages, 20% is Arabic, and 10% comes from English, Portuguese, German, Hindi, Chinese, and a couple of other languages. So for example, the word for school in Swahili is shule, which we got from the Germans. The word for money is pesa, which we got from the Portuguese. And the word for world is dunia, which we got from Hindi, and so on and so forth. Now, we're in Cape Town. Cape Town, in my view, is another very interesting nexus. It's where Asia meets Europe in Africa. So if you think about Africa in terms of a place that multiple cultures constantly interact, and then you see that solutions that start to speak to Africa could actually potentially inform solutions much further afield. So just quickly look at some of the languages. I spoke about Swahili just now. You can see that English is very widely spoken in Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, Arabic in the north, a bit of Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea, and then French, of course, which is another major language, particularly in Western Africa. And so this complexity that we look at when we talk about policy needs to be accessible, in terms of crossing between countries. Because even within the same region, for example, SADC, which is a block of about 15 countries in the Southern African Development Community, you find it has Portuguese, English, some French, and other languages. So we start to think even just across within the same region, we really have some challenges. And there's at least 4 major economic blocks in Africa. And if you look at the large populations, Nigeria, as I mentioned, is the biggest population, followed by Ethiopia, then Egypt, then the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then South Africa, and so on. So we've got very interesting distributions of population because they're not all concentrated in the one regional block. They're actually distributed quite generously, if I might say. And then if you look at also the richness of this continent, which is the traditional lens that the world has engaged with Africa. Africa is a place where you get resources cheaply and abundantly. And I think part of the challenge for design, and this is a plan we need to make together, is to help Africa add value to its own resources, not just send raw materials out and then import back interesting finished products. For example, until recently, Ghana, which is the largest producer of cocoa anywhere in the world, would export its cocoa beans and then import chocolate, and other products. And Happily Night's making its own chocolates, which are incredibly nice. And Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, which also are big producers of coffee, are doing something similar. So we need to look at those kind of things. Nigeria, as much as it's the biggest economy right now in Africa, may not necessarily be the most diverse. South Africa enjoys that status. It's got the most diversified economy. So we need to use design to see how we can unlock those kind of possibilities. And the others are just basic statistics which tell you something about the richness of the place. Then this is something that is very close to my heart. It's where the spirit of Ubuntu kicks in. It's about mutual support. It's about working together to support one another. This is two Ndebele women from Southern Africa. And even though you see the attire being quite similar, you can tell that one of them enjoys a slightly higher social status. And I'm sure none of you would miss the particular lady I have in mind. That would be the lady on the left. Okay? So there's a way in which we can actually engage with equity, but at the same time allow for those differentiations that make us who we are. And these are ladies from Botswana weaving baskets. And the idea of working together and is something very interesting. And I'd like maybe as referencing Giselle's presentation, because we often speak about design for competitive advantage, but I think we also need to think about design for comparative advantage and also collaborative advantage. I think we need to start to see how design can actually bring people together to do more than they would have managed on their own without losing that sense. And then the spider's web, which is a symbol for creativity. Again, if you look at the baskets from Botswana, they're rich with knowledge and meaning. In fact, sometimes one would just look at the basket and think, okay, this is pretty. But if you look at the detail of what someone is communicating, for example, the running ostrich or the ribs of the giraffe, you see how they reference nature and wildlife in that sense. And how the back of the python, which I hope never to see, is also a very good inspiration for design. And then something like the knees of a tortoise, I've actually never seen the knees, but I usually see the shell. But it's interesting to see how all that is captured in the richness of the design. And now that you see those baskets, you can actually start to pick up what those baskets actually mean. So you can see the urine of the bull and the flight of the sparrows and many others just based on the previous slide where you actually now understand the meaning that is embedded. So we need to use design to unlock indigenous knowledge and to also refresh it so that it's not just locked in the past, but it actually infuses modern design so that it has a truly authentic expression. This is a lady from Morocco, and just looking at the richness of all the artifacts around her, from the food she's preparing to the furniture to the drapes, it just shows you the richness that comes just from one simple activity like food preparation. Then I need to reference this interesting example of creativity from Kenya, which is known as the M-Pesa, which basically uses mobile phones to transfer money. And now up to 85% of any transactions done on a daily basis uses this system, where formal banking only does some 15% of the remaining banking. So it's possible to actually leapfrog, and I'm happy Ezio is here because we often have this discussion about Africa's potential to leapfrog using the available technology, which even the Premier references an exciting megatrend. So we don't need to have to go through wasteful stages of development. We can actually leapfrog into the 21st century in a much more sustainable and robust way. And then adaptability, which is what the turtle or the crocodile allows. It can live on water or in land, and we need to start to see these dugouts from Madagascar. Oh, this very interesting. In India, I've seen entire families carried on the Bajaj scooters, so this is not new for some people. But for others, this might look very interesting because this is an interesting version of a stretched limo from the streets of Uganda. And we need to learn from the past. I think I referenced indigenous knowledge systems before. This is a Sankofa symbol, which is very rich. The bird that has to bend its neck backwards to preen itself. So you need to learn from the past. This is again from Botswana. It's a much, you won't see this very often, but you need to go deep into the countryside to see this. But I find it very appropriate. It's a sledge that works very nicely in that environment. And those of you that have studied ergonomics, I'm sure, and human factors are cringing when you think those ladies might need a bit of lumbar support too. But we can discuss that beyond the system. And this image, which I really like, talks to me about exactly what this conference is about making a plan. When the engine is no longer functional, you don't discard the rest of the system. So we need to think of these hybridized solutions, and I think this is what I'd like to maybe invoke, that some of our design policies and design strategies could be hybridized in the sense that they speak to eclectic combinations that have richness that allows for different permutations. Ingenuity based on a board game known as Dame Dame. There's this young man from Malawi who invented a windmill. He did a TED talk sometime recently. And then this gentleman in Western Kenya who taught himself how to convert bicycles using little motors. So ingenuity is right across the continent. And we need to stop looking only in formal educational settings or formally educated designers as the basis for design policy or design strategy. We need to acknowledge that there's so much more happening beyond the formal space that needs to also get recognition and support. This is a project that was done by one of our former students, which is based on a LED lighting system to replace those little paraffin lamps that are ubiquitous on the continent. And this was being tested in Rwanda. And Barry Whitmill, who was behind this project, then evolved a system of how you can couple them in a modular way, and essentially also how you can use it to generate power, including using seesaws and so on, and solar energy and other systems. And then sustainability. We need to, this is the imperative of our age. We need to think about how design policy and design strategies can actually promote and support the idea of sustainability, not just from the environmental point of view, but social sustainability. And from what I understand through my many conversations with Ezio and others in that Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability movement, is we need to look at sustainability as the means towards social equity and cohesion. So we need to look at people and look at solutions that enhance social equity. We live in a place where we know that that's not the reality, but we could desire better. But also importantly, that our solutions bring about conviviality between people, that they improve human relationships and human understanding. And so there's a project we did with our friends from the Politecnico di Milano, the Mulo project, which is that vehicle that is based on bicycle parts and uses solar energy. But then at the same time, juxtaposing that against the Durban rickshaws, which are rich in culture and other influences, and not replacing those, because that speaks to something that has richness. So to find a happy medium, and in this case you'll see a rickshaw that was recently redesigned by a team from the Durban University of Technology, which tried to make it more comfortable for both the passengers and also for the operator, at the same time giving the identity that has got cultural and traditional value. This lady called Sarah from Botswana also evolved a system based on learning from what would be done in the past on bark cloth, where the interplanting of banana trees and these trees actually created a symbiotic relationship that was very sustainable. And after stripping the trees, they would wrap the same barks with banana leaves, which helped them to regenerate much quicker and much more efficiently. And these are the products you get out of the bark cloth. I'm sure some of you may have actually already seen these products before. And then quality, and I think this is something we need to see design policy to help people to actually raise the benchmark constantly. Because I think globally now you can come up with the most interesting design, but if it's clunky and it's of a crude nature, people will say that's very interesting from a conceptual point of view, but I don't want anything like that in my house or associated with me. So these are fabrics from Ghana, the richness of which is amazing, including the kente cloth, which you can see through, which has traditional meaning and basis. And I find this, as much as it might look macabre for some of you, these are fantasy coffins, again, from Ghana. Yes, cradle to cradle, and cradle to grave. I think we need to think about design in a much more versatile way. This quality for me shows that there's an attempt to connect the coffin with the life of the person who we're celebrating. So death is not actually the end, it's the beginning of another cycle. And each of those coffins, if you see the top left-hand corner, if you're partial to Coke, I'm sure that those who love Pepsi are not going to like this, then that might be your coffin. If you're a frequent flyer like some people, that could be customized. So if you're not keen on KLM and the etc. And the cocoa bean, again, we talked about Ghana's cocoa farming. And if you're a powerful chief or politician, you might get one of these coffins. And you see a Mercedes-Benz in the background, which would be for someone who's possibly wealthy and has access to that kind of lifestyle. So to me, this speaks to quality, and not just quality in terms of the final product, but quality of life. Not just from the time that you're being sent off, but even before that, so that we advance quality of life for people through our design policies and strategies. This is Luyanda's project, which was a 10 by 10 project co-sponsored by the Design Indaba, which used sandbag housing construction just down near Guguletu. So, and the Premier referenced the violence prevention through urban upgrading project, and this is how the community has kind of treated the murals of the wall, and we need to start to look at how that can be done. I think I spoke of conviviality already, and I'll reference the same VPUU where you can see how, for example, violent crime went down by up to 40% because this structure was put in place to bring about understanding within the township of Khayelitsha. So design against crime is a strategy, and we need to also find a way to give it expression. And community involvement in projects so that they can also own it. So participatory design as a methodology needs to be highlighted and also celebrating women, because there's so much contribution to make on this continent. Then beauty. I don't think we can speak about design without referencing beauty. And upstairs, I had the privilege of seeing some fantastic pieces of work. I'm sure many of you have had the chance to see it. And I'd like to suggest that every time you get a chance, as often as possible, drop up and see them again. And if you look at Africa, right from the traditional sense of beauty, and I'm here to break some stereotypes, because the symbol for beauty is the comb, which is meant to be the same symbol for female hygiene and beauty. But those young men from the Fulani up in North Nigeria have a tradition where they have to compete amongst themselves for their suitors. So the young ladies get to be the judges, and this beauty pageant has these lovely young men parading themselves, and they go to great lengths to make themselves attractive. And as you can tell, the smile is a very important part of that purpose. And then we have also our very own Laduma with his knitwear, who's a Durban-based designer. In fact, I think he's got a base here in Cape Town now. He's got a range called Makosa, which is inspired by his culture, where he realized that young men in that culture, after initiation into manhood, have to get new clothes. Not just the emperor who needs new clothes. The young men need new clothes, and he referenced his culture to come up with a very exciting and colorful knitwear range, which is now gone quite popular globally. And then taken two cultures from Namibia just to give that sense of diversity within which design happens in the same setting. You'll see the Vimba people on the left side and the top, a young girl there and the lady, as well as the Herero women. Both of them are cultures that interact a lot with cattle as their livestock. One uses the ghee from the livestock to engage and make intricate designs into their hair, while the other interpret the same because they had encounters with the German missionaries in the first early days, and they got fabrics through that interaction. But you can see from the headdress that they're referencing a certain animal, right? Everyone can tell which animal that is? Yeah? Andrea, you're right. Yeah, it's cattle. So you can see they reference that in their attires, just to bring that sense of beauty closer home. And then Ron Eglash, if you haven't seen his TED Talk, He's got a TED Talk, I think it was launched in June 2007. It's called The Fractals at the Heart of African Design. So fractal geometry is something that is at the heart of African design, which is often not appreciated fully. It's in the design of the homesteads, from the way it replicates the constellations in the stars. It's very interesting. And this is hairstyles that are inspired by fractals from the Congo. And I'd like to just encourage you to just take your time, Google those and check them out. Very interesting to see how that is done. So you can see the geometry done, and Ron Eglash is a mathematician. So you see the mathematics of the actual hairstyle, and then the way in which it's expressed in actual design in a very tactile way. Democracy, that's a symbol of two crocodiles. Actually, they're known as Siamese crocodiles because they have different mouths and legs, but they share the same stomach. And democracy reminds us that we might have different functions and roles in society, but we share a common destiny. And so that stomach that we all share means that even though we do different things and play different roles, we need to remember that our destinies are intertwined. So we look at how Sub-Saharan Africa is rising. I mean, we can see that, but also counter it against the other challenges that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned, for example, the quality of life, which you can see in terms of the regions. You can tell that in the North Maghreb region, the quality of life is much higher than many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on and so forth. And then also the role of women. I think women and youth as a special focus of unlocking potential on this continent needs to be dealt with. So as much as policy is going to be generic, I think we also need to look at how that can be done. We also need to realize that as much as development is linked to many other indices, unfortunately it's also linked to CO2 emissions, and we need to address environmental issues in our thinking. We also look at happiness, which is very controversial. I'm sure many people will look at this and start saying, how does Africa fare with in terms of other parts of the world? And if you look in terms of the happiness index, you'll see that Angola is meant to be quite happy, but if you look at other indices, it's quite an authoritarian kind of system. So one starts to wonder how you can get this balanced. And then I talked about the population distribution, but the reason this is there is because I wanted to remind us that as much as we have challenges in one part of Africa that look unique, there are many challenges that are similar. So for example, if you look at the previous slide, this is about population, and this one tells you about slum populations. So it's populations, but now in slums. You'll notice that South Africa right at the bottom, which has highly publicized challenges, actually is not doing as badly as we might be thinking. I'm not saying that we're off the hook, no, by no means. But if you look at a place like Sierra Leone, right, where you see the gray dot of Liberia, because they didn't have the data, you'll find Sierra Leone is just above that. This is the region where Ebola is really hitting hard. And you can see the densities of populations in slums could be one of the reasons why these things are happening. With almost 95% of the population living in slums in the cities, that tells you we have a challenge. Lorraine here, is working in some slums in Nkanini out in Stellenbosch. And this is one of the challenges for Africa to prioritize and look at how we can improve this. Then to look at transformation. This is an infographic of, which is a mixed bouquet, because you've got good things and bad things, like 80 successful military coups. I don't think anyone wants to brag about that. But right next to it, we'd be very happy to say we have 53 million cell phone users. 31% of secondary school enrollment. What happens to the other 69%? We have challenges there. 36% live on less than $1 a day, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have to look at design as something that is really versatile in terms of responding to this. And then also to see what's going to be happening in the next couple of years. You can see the first circle is actually the current population at 2010, and then 2025 you can see how big some of those places will be. If you look at what's happening in Lagos, it's going to be almost 16 million people living in that city, while in Cairo, which is going to have just over 13 million and so on. And then the middle class, you can see the rising middle class, and design usually focuses on the middle class as a category that drives design, both in terms of consumption and also renewal of design thinking. But then at the same time, look at solutions like Stephen Lamb has been working with the idea of making shacks more hospitable, even as an interim measure. I think Will Spencer said that all progress is incremental. And we need sometimes to look at this in context and not just say everyone's going to suddenly get to the same level of standard of living, but to put in stages and phases ways in which we can actually realize that. And then just to put it in context, you can see why GPS is necessary in this country. Just in case you were wondering where the road signs end up, they actually become very interesting structures. But what I like is if you notice the little pit latrine at the bottom, it does actually reference the direction that things should be going. Yeah. And then emancipation. I'm not a big fan of the word empowerment, because I think empowerment suggests that someone has power and is willing to relinquish just a little bit of it. I think emancipation is a lot more radical and more open, because it means we can negotiate power because it's open. And I'm bigger on that idea. So just to summarize now, in terms of the Quad Helix model of development and partnerships, which is basically business, education, governance, and society, I wanted to reference just an African proverb, just to help me conceptualize this. There's an African proverb that says that if you can talk, you can sing. And if you can walk, you can dance. Okay? Now, it's very simple in the way it says, if I can talk, I can sing. If I can walk, I can dance. But it supposes that the same potential to dance exists in the potential to walk, and the potential for singing resides in the potential to talk. But I think there's a catalyst that needs to happen between the point of talking to singing and the point of walking to dancing. And I think this is, I'd like to just put that in context and speak to that. I think that design policy, if I was to call design policy the singing, I think, if I was to say design policy is the dance, the design policy needs to energize what's already happening, okay? If I look at design strategy, on the other hand, as the singing, I think design strategy needs to amplify what is happening. So we need to amplify the song, and we need to energize the dance. And I think this is just to contextualize what I wanted to say quickly. And as I run down towards my summary, I think there's a couple of ideas that I'd like just to conclude with. One is, I think, design policy and design strategy. I use the two interchangeably. So if you see design policy, I refer to both because I think they're both important. We need the two. To celebrate and elaborate on what design is doing already. And I feel, and the CCDI, which is the Cape Craft and Design Institute, is doing an excellent job in this city to bring an understanding of how craft and design can better work together. And I think in Africa there's a lot of craft which is ignored. And I think the NID in India has for a very long time been a champion of bringing craft and design into the same space. We need to reference craft as a way to unlock design potential. I think that's one way I would look at it. So as a logical extension and basis for design discourse, I think we need to acknowledge that. In terms of collaboration, and I mentioned earlier on, not merely competition, I think there's mechanisms for regional exchange need to be unlocked. We've got possibilities. I think we talked about the challenges in language, logistics, the massive scale of this continent. But we need to find ways to, whether it's using digital platforms like the network that through Adrienne's leadership we started in 1999 called the Network of Africa Designers, which has membership in at least 12 countries now. We need to find ways to engage and collaborate much more robustly. Then in terms of differentiation and participation, we need to look at design disciplines, because the truth of the matter, and from ICSID's point of view, this is a conversation we're often having, of how design is constantly expanding and evolving, and how design policy needs to embrace this multi, cross and now transdisciplinary way in which things are happening. And then in terms of education, we still have to do so much to educate people about design. We can't take it for granted. And I think part of what I really love about the World Design Capital, it has actually brought about this space in which now we can actually discuss what design really means. Is design what we thought it meant for serving the 10%? Or is it something that we can expand to include the 90%? And my view is that it's not the 10 or the 90, it's actually both. We need both. We need the 10% to catalyze high-end innovation and reward designers for their efforts, but at the same time, the 90% reminds us that we're human and that our humanity is inextricably linked to theirs as well. And then in terms of promotion and capacitation, we need to look at how design policy and design strategy can do that, so that institutions, particularly those that are involved in promotional activities, can actually be strengthened. And then obviously protection and regulation. A lot of designers are exploited. It's a fact. In fact, in my knowledge, Kenya has a design policy in the making. It's actually sitting as a bill waiting for parliamentary support and therefore adoption. Well, the Western Cape has a strategy, so there are not that many on the continent to reference. So we need to find ways in which we can protect designers. In Kenya, I think for a very long time, one of the challenges was something that Giselle mentioned earlier. Design was seen as a quasi-profession. It was not seen as a full profession like engineering or architecture. And many times designers were treated as quasi-professionals, whereas they had university degrees, in this case, graduate degrees, but not recognized even so. And then, so the recognition, which I think happens, and the protection, the recognition, and using design to transform the way in which things are, the wicked problems that are constantly around us, and I think Africa is rich in that. In fact, one of the debates I usually have is, if necessity is the mother of invention, why is Africa not a superpower in innovation? And I'd like just to end with one thought. Ben Okri says that there are three Africas. The one I see every day, the one they write about, those beyond our waters, and the real magical Africa we don't see unfolding through all the difficulties of our time, like a quiet miracle. And I'd like to say, as much as there are those three Africas, maybe we can design a different Africa that is a combination of all those things and makes it a richer place for everyone by making a plan through design strategy and policy that speaks to our needs. Thank you very much.